Russians are no slouches when it comes to oil work, but they were out of circulation from 1940 through 2000. The techs involved came a long way in that time. Foreigners, most notably supermajor BP and services firms Halliburton and Schlumberger, are responsible for half-ish of contemporary Russia's output. Any broad-scale removal of Western firms from the mix would have catastrophic impacts upon oil production throughout the entire former Soviet space. The Ukraine war is stress-testing that theory. For their part, the Azerbaijani and Kazakh projects are far and away the world's most technically exacting. Think Kashagan. Aside from the handful of folks in the world's supermajors who designed these projects, no one on the planet can maintain them. Then there's the issue of export routes. All of the broader region's oil flows first travel by pipe, in some cases for literally thousands of miles, before they reach either a customer or a discharge port. Pipes can't dodge. Anything that impedes a single inch of pipe shuts the whole thing down. That's fine and dandy. Post-order? Not so much. About half the flows terminate in end users like Germany, while the other half must be loaded on tankers for sale. That's where things get extra dicey. In the Pacific, the Nakodka port sits smack in the middle of the Japanese, Chinese, and Korean spheres of influence. Any meaningful conflict involving any of the three, and Nakodka either becomes occupied or a crater. Or, more likely, occupied and then a crater. Out to the west, exports via the Black Sea ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse are fully dependent upon sales through downtown Istanbul, so any hiccup in relations with the Turks kills a couple million barrels of daily flows. Farther north, anything out of Primorsk has to sail the Baltic Sea and the Skagerrak Strait, sailing by no fewer than 7 navally over-capable to their size countries that tend to nurse pathological fears and hatreds toward all things Russian, in addition to Germany, in addition to the United Kingdom. Even if that were not enough, there's one more complicating factor. Siberia, despite getting cold enough to literally freeze your nose off in October, doesn't get cold enough. Most Russian oil production is in the permafrost, and for most of the summer, the permafrost is inaccessible because its top layer melts into a messy, horizon-spanning swamp. Tapping oil here requires waiting for the land to freeze, building dike roads across the wasteland, and drilling in the Siberian winter. Should something happen to consumption of Russian crude, flows back up through the literally thousands of miles of pipes right to the drill site. Should exports fail, whether due to a war far away, a war on Russia, or a war by Russia, there is but one mitigation: shut it all down. Turning production back on would require manually checking everything, all the way from the well to the border. The last time this happened was the Soviet collapse in 1989. 33 years on, Russia still hasn't gotten back to its Cold War production levels. Only during the oil-ravenous stability of the post-Cold War period of the American-led order is the current iteration of Russia's internationalized oil complex even possible. And with the Ukraine war, it is already over. The third and final major source of global crude is within North America. A lot of oil output on the continent falls into the general category of legacy, in regions that have been producing for upwards of a century. The first Mexican production dates all the way back to the 1920s and has been supplying Mexico with everything it needs and more ever since. In recent years, many of Mexico's large, old fields have been giving up the ghost. In part, the reason is geology, but at least as important is Mexican state policy, which often bars foreign capital, expertise, and technology from playing much of a role at all. For decades, even North Korea had less stringent investment laws on its energy sector. Left to their own devices, the Mexicans are proving incapable at keeping their old fields on life support and exploiting newer discoveries either on or offshore. Even with this glaring weakness, Mexico's oil needs are roughly in balance. It exports some crude to the United States and then imports a similar volume of refined product. On balance, Mexico produces and uses about 2 million barrels per day. Up north, the Canadian oil sector got its start in the 1950s, becoming globally significant in the 1970s. But it wasn't until the 1980s that the province of Alberta started cracking the code on some seriously unconventional output. Traditionally, oil migrates through rock formations until it reaches an impermeable rock layer. For example, the crude might migrate through sandstone, but granite would stop it cold. Pressure then builds behind the impermeable layer. When a drill punches through the cap, the pressure and oil are released. Most of Alberta's oil is nothing like that. Instead of big pressurized liquid pools of crude locked behind tough rock, Alberta's oil is diffused through far softer rock, functionally integrated into the rock's matrix in solid form. Getting it out requires either injecting steam into the formation to melt the oil out, or mining it and washing the oil out with hot water. From there, this ultra-thick crude oil must be mixed with lighter crude grades to thin it so it can be pumped via conventional pipeline. No matter how it is measured, Canada produces far more than it could ever use. It consumes a similar amount to Mexico, but exports that much again. Almost all of Alberta's oil sands production is shipped south to the United States, mostly for processing in Texas. In the continent's middle latitudes, the Americans have a lot going on. They have a legacy offshore sector in the Gulf of Mexico that didn't really get going until the 1970s. There is still conventional crude trickling out of Pennsylvania and Texas in places that have been producing oil longer than any other spots on the planet. Even California was among the country's largest oil producers until quite recently, with one of the country's most prolific wells located in a mall on Wilshire Boulevard, while another is cleverly disguised as a synagogue. Taken together, the American conventional oil legacy remains substantial, still kicking out about 4 million barrels per day, a volume that compares favorably to Iran at its 1970s height, and is about the same as the total output from Canada today. But the real story is the new stuff, America's shale oil sector. Back in the early 2000s, the world of oil got slammed by 4 simultaneous and unrelated events. First, the US subprime build was already getting out of hand, generating unhealthy levels of demand for all the things that go into home construction: lumber, concrete, copper, steel, and oil. Second, the Chinese boom was getting a touch insane. Price-insensitive demand drove up the price of all globally available commodities, oil included. Third, in 2002, a very unsuccessful coup in Venezuela led to a very successful political purge of the country's state oil firm, a purge that focused on the technocrats who produced the oil. The country's energy sector never recovered. Fourth, in 2003, the Americans invaded Iraq, taking all its oil output offline. The country didn't return to pre-war levels of output for 16 years. Between higher demand and lower supplies, oil prices steadily climbed from below $10 a barrel in 1998 to nearly $150 a barrel in 2008. When your work earns you $10, you tend to stick to the tried and true. When your work earns you $150, you can afford to try all kinds of things. With a few years of experimentation, the collective American energy complex was able to crack the code on something we now call the shale revolution. In essence, shale operators drill down as per normal, but when they reach a petroleum-rich rock strata, they take a sharp turn, drilling horizontally along the entire layer. They then pump water and sand at high pressure into the formation. Since liquids do not compress, the rock cracks apart from within, freeing untold trillions of tiny pockets of oil and natural gas that would otherwise be far too small to harvest with conventional drilling. The sand suspended in the frac fluid props the cracks open, while the now freed oil provides reverse pressure that pushes the water back up the pipe. Once the water has cleared, the oil continues flowing. Voila! a shale well is born.